What can you do in 5 minutes and 32 seconds? You could listen to an entire album by Nails. You could watch Commando the musical, which you probably should do anyway as it's one of the great works of art produced by man. You could watch the Herald of Darkness scene from Alan Wake 2, so you don't actually have to play that towering blunder of a game. And before your comment fingers get all itchy and you grasp frantically for your keyboard to tell me how wrong I am and how great that game really was, ask yourself, was it? Was it really? Or was it just one memorable set piece in the middle of a terrible third-person shooter where you spend more time playing FBI solitaire than shooting things? In your secret heart, you know these things to be true. However, if you're Mirko Cro Cop, you could take those 5 minutes and 32 seconds and use them to successfully defend the Lineal heavyweight title 3 times. When we last saw Cro Cop in the previous installment of this series, he had just beaten the man whose head was harder than Halo 2 on legendary difficulty, Kazuyuki Fujita, at Inoki Bombay 2002 to claim the Lineal heavyweight title. The Lineal title's line of succession was Coleman, Smith, Couture, Inoue, Kerr, Fujita, and now Cro Cop. But before we discuss Cro Cop's Lineal title reign, it's worth exploring how he got there in the first place. Like most children in the 1980s, Crow Kid had been hoodwinked by Frank Dukes into thinking that Bloodsport was a Ken Burns documentary about how competing in a no-holds-barred bare-knuckle kumite leads to a lifetime of boats and hoes. Upon his exposure to the fantastic world of Frank Dukes, Crow Kid made the decision to begin training. Living in rural Croatia, choices were limited, and most of Cro Cop's early training was done with homemade equipment in an old shed. Once he was a Crow grown up, Mirko joined the Croatian army, where he was possibly nicknamed Crow Soldier. But a career in the military wasn't to be, as he was released from duty, likely after his commander saw this picture and realised that this man was never meant to wage war with firearms, but with legs. Mirko was given leave from the military to pursue a career in kickboxing, and began competing in K1 in 1996. He had a decent run, and his highlights included making it to the 1999 Grand Prix final, where he ultimately fell short of capturing the title after succumbing to a series of brutal body shots courtesy of Ernesto Hoost. He also owned wins over kickboxing royalty Peter Arts and Jerome LeBanner. At this time, he was moonlighting between K1 and working in the Croatian police anti-terrorist unit, Luchko, and had assumed his final form, that of the anti-terrorist and, weirdly, anti-sex Cro Cop. Cro Cop's first MMA fights went about as well as a Rogan stand-up special with no stool. His debut was the 2001 fight with Fujita that was stopped 39 seconds into round 1 due to a cut. His second fight was against Nobuhiko Takada, a man who famously had little to no fighting experience outside of pro wrestling. Despite his limited skill set, Takada had failed forward in the world of non-scripted fighting to such a ludicrous degree that in 1997 he goaded Rickson Gracie into a fight that ultimately birthed the entire Pride promotion. Takada allegedly broke his foot in the opening round of the fight with Cro Cop and spent more time on his back than a milk-drunk newborn, while Mirko kicked fruitlessly at his legs for 15 minutes. The fight was a special rules match and had no judges. Therefore, with no decisive winner, the match was declared a draw and the crowd was declared bored. He would also face off against a man named Yuji Nagata. Nagata has to be the most unfortunate man to dabble in MMA since Japanese MC Hammer Soichi Nishida.
Oh no, this is something else.
It's kind of like East LA meets ninjutsu.
Nagata was one of the top draws in New Japan Pro Wrestling, and New Japan's founder, Antonio Inoki, wanted to try and create a superstar who could conquer the worlds of pro wrestling and MMA. And despite the slight handicap of not training MMA or knowing what MMA is, Nagata was chosen to be Inoki's future MMA and pro wrestling champion, all of which begs the question, what the fuck was going on with Japanese Krusty the Clown back there? Unfortunately for Inoki, Crow Cop defragmented Nagata's brain with a head kick 21 seconds into round 1, and his attempt to conquer the twin peaks of MMA and pro wrestling collapsed. Not content with giving Nagata a leg-induced near-death experience, 2 years later, Inoki sent Nagata into a state-sanctioned execution when he was matched up against none other than Fedor fucking Emelianenko. Nagata only had 2 MMA fights, yet somehow had the almost comical level of misfortune that both his opponents were the 2 biggest killers of his era. Nagata was essentially doing a real-life Soul Level 1 boss rush of Pride. In the kind of bizarre twist of fate that seems to only happen in MMA, at the same event where kickboxing legend Crow Cop beat a pro wrestler named Tadao Yasuda beat kickboxing legend Jerome LeBanner and restored balance to the carny-ass combat sports universe. Crow Cop's star began its ascendancy in Pride with a far more exciting match against well-known knee enthusiast Vanderlei Silva.
Vanderlei Silva, he's a good striker himself too, but not K1 level, although he can surprise people. He's got a strange flying knee, he's got strange hands, and he's constantly coming.
The fight was similar to the Takada match in that it was another special rules match with no judges, but unlike the Takada fight, it had 100% less collapsing to the ground like it was a self-defense mechanism against natural predators. Crow Cop vs Silva was billed as K1 vs Pride, and was by far the toughest challenge of Crow Cop's MMA career to date. At the time of their first fight, Silva was one of the most terrifying men in combat sports whose name wasn't Vince McMahon, owning wins over Guy Mezger, Dan Henderson, and Kazushi Sakuraba. To put into perspective how violent this man's run in Pride was, he would eventually be tied for first place for most knockouts in Pride history. The man he tied with? Fucking Crow Cop. Being tied for most knockouts in Pride with Vanderlei Silva is like being tied for most demons killed in Doom with the fucking Doom guy. It's an impressive statistic no matter what angle you approach it from. Crow Cop vs Silva 1 gave us one of the greatest stare downs of all time.
Now, I stated, oh boy!
One of the loudest crowd pops of all time.
Vanderlei got the lock. Oh, Vanderlei's got him down! Vanderlei got Crow Cop down!
And one of the most wholesome moments of all time, when Crow Cop began blowing kisses at Vanderlei in between rounds. Although, looking at it now, I don't think it was intended to be wholesome. With this being another special rules match with no judges, when the final bell rang and both men were still standing, the only possible decision that could be made was to rule it a draw. Crow Cop's next opponent was Japanese legend Kazushi Sakuraba. The year was 2002, a time when you may have seen Kelly Rowland texting Nelly via Microsoft Excel on a pager. Sakuraba and Crow Cop would face off in the main event at Pride Shockwave, August 28th of that year. I know I tend to discuss Pride with the kind of overeager enthusiasm of a rescue dog trying to make a friend, but in a body of work littered with spectacular events, it's not exaggeration or hyperbole to say that Shockwave 2002 still manages to stand apart from the rest. It's got me really fired up. Many years from now, if I'm still watching MMA in between diaper changes at the care home, I can guarantee that should I live that long, I will still never have seen anything to rival the majesty of Pride Shockwave 2002. Depending on who you believe, the attendance for Shockwave was either 91,107 or 71,000. 91,107 was the official attendance, 71,000 was a more conservative estimate based on the idea that Pride routinely fluffed their attendance figures. Whichever number you choose, it's still a record for largest attendance for an MMA event of all time by an absolutely ludicrous margin, so take your pick. As dusk gathered in the Tokyo National Stadium, one of the godfathers of MMA, Antonio Inoki, made his entrance by jumping out of a helicopter and parachuting into the arena.
Well, here he comes! Inoki! Inoki! He's coming down! Oh, where he is! Way up there! What a wild man! He's got a camera on him up close. He's hovering somewhere over the rainbow, way up high above the National Stadium here outside Tokyo, Japan.
Next, Helio Gracie arrived in a far more pedestrian fashion, by walking. He opened the ceremony by lighting a brazier so large that Gondor thought the Tokyo National Stadium was calling for aid. All of this was backed by the kind of stage show that made Shockwave 2002 seem like a dry run for a Taylor Swift tour. Fireworks, light shows, and the incessant thrum of 90,000 cheering fans. Bas Rutten and Stephen Quadros were on commentary duties that night, and to see two grown men who had already done dozens of these shows still manage to be overcome with genuine excitement and awe for what they're seeing is honestly infectious.
Shockwave! That's right. Look at this view!
Once the fight started, Shockwave 2002 didn't disappoint. I don't know if the Japanese just innately hate themselves like we Irish, but that's the only reason I can think of as to why they offered up some random karate bum as a representative of Japan to be sacrificed to Vanderlei Silva. A fight broke out at a grappling match when Hidehiko Yoshida beat Royce Gracie via a controversial Ezekiel choke. Royce claimed he wasn't choked out, and a mass brawl erupted when he attempted to have the decision overturned.
There's some kind of a brawl going on. What's going on here? There seems to be some discontent. Controversy in the ring.
And I'm sure you're all as stunned as I am at the notion of a Gracie family member claiming they didn't lose a fight. Don Frye was famous for two things: brawling like he was at a Waffle House and having a mustache you could set your watch to. What he was not known for was high-level kickboxing technique, so it was a wonder that he opted for a kickboxing match with Jerome Le Banner rather than a good old-fashioned mustache duel, which he would have won with ease. What World War I did to advance the cause of cosmetic surgery, Bob Sapp did for spinal injuries when he fought Minotauro Nogueira. And in the main event, Cro Cop faced off against Sakuraba. Cro Cop wasn't the biggest heavyweight you'll ever see, but Sakuraba was definitely the smallest. In 2002, Pride's heavyweight division wasn't the roster of monsters that it would be by 2006, and letting their self-hatred shine, Pride loved nothing more than attempting to kill its own stars, so Sakuraba hit the buffet to pad out the roster at heavyweight. The biggest complaint levied at Cro Cop till that point was that he was just a striker. Although, when the average Cro Cop head kick was the answer to the question what killed the dinosaurs, I feel like being just a striker was more than sufficient. Regardless, people still argued that his ground game was about as substantial as the average TikTok, a theory that would voraciously be put to the test against a grappler like Sakuraba. Cro Cop did get taken down, but spent the majority of the fight with Sakuraba in his guard, almost completely nullifying Sakuraba's grappling. Perhaps due to fear of the takedown, Sakuraba did better on the feet than expected too, and kind of scored a knockdown, but it was really more of a jumping fist that caused both men to collapse in a heap. Krokop continued to stymie Sakuraba with his closed guard, and even landed some offense off his back. This wasn't exactly Craig Jones versus Gabby Garcia levels of grappling, but it was more than most people thought Mirko to be capable of. The fight was eventually stopped in round 2 after an upkick from Krokop broke Sakuraba's orbital bone. All of this leads us back to Inoki Bombaye 2002. Contracts being what they were in those days, Krokop wasn't exclusively tied to Pride. So when New Year's Eve 2002 rolled around, he took a detour and rematched Kazuyuki Fujita under the Inoki Bombaye banner. Fujita may not have been the most talented man to hold the lineal heavyweight title, but he was also far from the worst. He had out-wrestled Mark Kerr, who was a Division 1 champion, to claim the title. And while it is true that Kerr had been drained of all life force as if he had just drank from the false grail thanks to throwing everything in his arsenal at Fujita's head, it was still an impressive win for Fujita and proved he was no joke. Well, it proved he was only somewhat of a joke. Krokop rang in the new year the old-fashioned way, by inflicting grievous bodily harm upon a stranger. He held Fujita down for almost the full 15 minutes and pelted his impenetrable dome with a barrage of murder knees. But Fujita's head had the same inexplicable durability of Nicolas Cage's acting career, and he clung to consciousness till the closing bell. Krokop was declared the victor, and 2003 dawned with Mirko Krokop Filipovic as the 7th reigning lineal heavyweight title holder. While the lineal title can jump between organisations, it's generally agreed upon that it can't transition between sports. Otherwise, we'd be living in a world today where Tyson Fury is the lineal MMA heavyweight champion, so Krokop's first fight after winning the title was actually ineligible as a lineal title defence as he jumped back to K1 for a kickboxing match. However, his opponent was none other than the clown prince of combat sports, the corned beef leviathan himself, Bob the Beast Sapp, so there's no way in hell I'm not talking about this.
Welcome to Oblivion!
For anyone unfamiliar, Bob Sapp is a 6'5", 400-pound martial stack of solid muscle. He's lost in K1, Pride, Dream, Strikeforce. If you can think of an organisation, there's a good chance Bob Sapp has lost a fight in it. But 2003 was a very different time for the Beast. Long before he became infamous as the kind of fighter who taps to a glove touch, Bob Sapp was terrorising the world of K1.
Shatter and die!
Sapp was to kickboxing what Puddle of Mud were to grunge, loosely inspired by, but transforming it into something utterly grotesque and wholly separate from its source material. Bob Sapp wouldn't be able to identify a kick if it was in a police lineup, yet somehow he had beaten arguably the greatest kickboxer of all time, Ernesto Hoost, not once, but twice. He only had one loss on his kickboxing record at that point, which was in fact a disqualification after Sapp appeared to forget that referees aren't just there for decoration and that the rules of kickboxing don't allow for Super Mario stomps to the head. To say that this fight escalates in intensity faster than the average game of Russian roulette is to commit a grave understatement, so I'm just going to play the whole thing and let you see for yourself. Okay, so you can probably tell where this is going. As much as I wanted to show you the entire fight, as it is 40 seconds of absolute chaos, YouTube's copyright bots had other ideas. As such, I've had to trim the whole thing down from 40 seconds to 10. Unfortunately, a lot of other changes had to be made in terms of removing licensed music from one particular segment and cutting fight footage out from others, in order to get this video on YouTube. Patronage is and always will be optional, but if you'd like to both support the channel and see the full unedited version, it's on Patreon now for $1. Thank you. Fighting Bob Sapp in 2003 was a more terrifying prospect than seeing a check engine light on your dashboard. But if Cro Cop couldn't beat Ernesto Hoost, he'd beat the man who beat Hoost instead. Sapp vs Cro Cop took place on the 30th of March 2003 at the K1 World Grand Prix.
A suitable match.
Sapp immediately tried to rush Cro Cop and overwhelm him with size and power, but Mirko expertly played Matador to Sapp's steroid-devouring dreadnought, and midway through round 1, landed a left hand that broke Sapp's cheekbone. He collapsed to the canvas in agony, and the fight was waved off.
Damage critical. Losing life support.
Okay, Igor Vovchanchin is going to face Cro Cop. Now, Cro Cop is coming in pride.
Cro Cop's first official defense of the Lineal title would be against Heath Herring at Pride 26, Bad to the Bone. On June 8, 2003, Bad to the Bone was a card filled with shocks. This was the event where Fujita almost became heavyweight champion when he hit Fedor hard enough to make him do the soft shoe shuffle, and a hot new prospect named Anderson Silva was choked out in the first round of his match with Daiju Takase, a man whose most notable win was in a freak show fight against 600-pound Emmanuel Yarborough. Heath Herring was the definition of a journeyman in MMA. He had a solid career with wins over Mark Kerr, Igor Vovchanchin and Enson Inoue, but he reached his level cap early on, and with the rapid evolution of MMA, he simply couldn't rise above it, meaning he would never be able to compete with the greats of that era. While he attempted to compensate for this by giving Japanese Krusty the Clown a run for his money in the stupid haircuts game, his fight with Cro Cop would not join the list of shocking outcomes provided by Bad to the Bone. Herring knew he couldn't stand and strike with Cro Cop, so attempted multiple takedowns, but Cro Cop's takedown defense had improved to the point where it was basically the blueprint for anyone looking to avoid a takedown going forward. He stuffed every takedown attempt and refused to engage with Herring on the ground. It wasn't a case of if Cro Cop was going to win, but simply a matter of when. Approximately 3 minutes and 17 seconds into round 1, he landed a left leg to Herring's liver, and the fight was over. Cro Cop's next Lineal title defense was against Igor Vovchanchin at Pride Total Elimination 2003. The last time we saw Vovchanchin in this series was back in August of 2000, when he was trying to find out what the inside of Enson Inoue's head looked like on the outside. Vovchanchin was one of the greats of his day. He had been fighting since 1995, and at one point held the almost inconceivable achievement of being on a fucking 37 fight winning streak. I can't even take a shit 37 times in a row without at least one of them going wrong, never mind win 37 fist fights back to back. The problem for Vovchanchin was that by the time he fought Cro Cop, he was on his 50-fucking-9th pro fight. Taking on a surging phenom like Cro Cop after 59 fights is a bit like trying to get a Pentium 2 to run Elden Ring. It's probably not going to produce the results you're hoping for. For Cro Cop, however, it produced one of the greatest highlight reel knockouts on his resume. Mirko had a saying, right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. The left leg he hit Vovchanchin with was so brutal it bypassed the cemetery altogether and reduced Vovchanchin into a regretful pile of ashes.
Other left, some blood. Oh, high kick and down goes Igor. He is out. Down goes Igor. Cro Cop with a left high kick. This man is taking over.
By this point in his career, and despite his reductive attitudes towards sex, Cro Cop was one of the top draws in Pride and a big star in Japan. So for his next fight, Pride decided to give him a layup. His opponent, making his Pride debut, with a record of 3 wins and 2 losses against a parade of bums, not one of them worthy to have so much as a Wikipedia page, was a man named Dos Caras Jr., or as pro wrestling fans likely know him, Alberto Del Rio. Del Rio and Cro Cop would face off at Pride Bushido 1 on October 5th, 2003. The Bushido events were sort of like the UFC Fight Night cards, events designed to give up-and-coming fighters a showcase, so putting Cro Cop into this event created the kind of power imbalance normally reserved for my daydreams about Vladislav and Galligan. There isn't much to say about this fight really. It was about as open a goal as Pride could have possibly staged for Cro Cop. The only way it could have been any easier would be if the Yakuza had killed Dos Caras backstage and Pride officials weekend at Bernie's him out to the ring. Dos Caras Jr. was, to my knowledge, the first, and to date only man to compete in professional MMA while wearing a luchador mask, which just makes the inevitable knockout seem both simultaneously tragic and hilarious. It's the kind of gimmick that makes you wonder if Dos Caras really knew what he was getting into, as to me, this is the look of a man who is expecting to take part in a worked fight. The execution of Dos Caras Jr. took all of 46 seconds.
You win!
I never had such an easy victory.
The real heavyweight title and the lineal heavyweight title have one statistic in common. The record for consecutive defenses of the real UFC heavyweight title is 3, held by Stipe Miocic, and at the time of Cro Cop's lineal title reign, the record for consecutive defenses of the lineal title was also 3. Almost every other division has far longer title reigns, such as Anderson Silva at middleweight, GSP at welterweight, or at women's flyweight, my warrior queen, now restored and resplendent upon her throne, the words of those who said it couldn't be done, the whisperings of the doubters, those words are not for her ears. Instead, they return to fall like rain upon the doubters' misbegotten heads. She treads on gods and godlike things, on fate and fear and life and death, on hate that cleaves and love that clings, all that is brought forth of man's breath, and perisheth with what it brings. I'm sorry, I don't know what that was. I think I have a problem. Likely due to the power the majority of heavyweights possess, it's simply a lot harder to hold on to the title when it comes to heavyweights. Much like the actual heavyweight title, both Fujita and Cro Cop were tied for most consecutive defenses of the lineal title, with 3 each. While Cro Cop's confidence and star power were soaring after sending Dos Caras on the lightless walk, a month later, in November of 2003, he was set to face another rising star in Pride, Antonio Minotauro Nogueira, and the rule of 3 would be proven to be immutable. For most of 2003, Cro Cop had only one thing on his mind, not having sex, but also the Pride heavyweight title. The only problem was, it was currently around the waist of Fedor Emelianenko. Cro Cop had called out Fedor after his win over Vovchanchyn.
I hope next fight will be title fight against the champion Emelianenko Fedor. Thank you.
Whoa, he's calling Emelianenko Fedor out.
Calling him out.
And Fedor, overcome with emotion, accepted this challenge in the most Slavic way possible, by allowing the muscles in his face to briefly contract and form an ambiguous approximation of a flicker of a smile. The two had been scheduled to meet at Pride Final Conflict 2003, but Fedor had broken his thumb punching Gary Goodridge in the head, so in his place stepped Nogueira. Minotauro Nogueira is the eldest of identical twin brothers, identical in appearance and damn near identical in name too, being Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira and Antonio Rogerio Nogueira. To avoid any confusion going forward, I'll just be referring to him by his nicknames, Minotauro or Big Nog. Big Nog was a fighter in spite of fate seeming to conspire to make him anything but. At age 10, he was involved in a near-fatal accident after he was run over by a reversing truck.
I was in coma for a couple of days after that. I had my lung, my liver, and kidneys. And then my legs, my Achilles, and the other leg too, all the tendons behind the knee. My ribs was broke. It was really bad. I was in the hospital for like 10 months.
The accident meant that one of the few reliable ways to distinguish him from his twin brother was thanks to the giant scar on his back, a lasting reminder that life is both precious and worryingly fragile. Nogueira began his MMA career in 1999, debuting in World Extreme Fighting. But it was in a promotion called Rings where he started to make a name for himself. Rings was originally a pro wrestling organization, but when its owner, Akira Maeda, a pro wrestler himself, saw the rising popularity of no-holds-barred fighting in Japan with Pride and Pancrase, he realized that owning a pro wrestling organization at that point was about as savvy an investment as buying NFTs in 2024. He transitioned Rings into a legitimate fighting organization, and Nogueira became its biggest name. He beat 5 men over the course of 2 nights to win the vaguely blasphemous-sounding King of Kings tournament in 2000. But it was his run in Pride that would truly put Nogueira on the path to greatness. What Cro Cop was to striking, Minotauro was to jiu-jitsu. In total, 21 of his 34 career wins were by submission, but unlike pure jiu-jitsu fighters such as Enson Inoue, Nogueira didn't have to solely rely on his grappling. He was part of a new breed of mixed martial artist and had trained in boxing, jiu-jitsu and judo from an early age. While his preference was the ground, he was comfortable on the feet too and has 3 wins by knockout on his record. That isn't a lot. Not even sure why I mention it, really.
Foreshadowing as a narrative device.
Had Fedor never been born, there's a good case to be made for Nogueira being the greatest heavyweight of all time. Before joining Pride in 2001, in 14 fights, the sole loss on his record was a controversial split decision to Dan Henderson in Rings. A loss which he would emphatically avenge at Pride 24 when he submitted Henderson via armbar. He ran through his first opponents in Pride like a morning coffee, making short work of Gary Goodridge and the Pride 2000 openweight champion Mark Coleman. At the time of Nogueira's debut, Pride didn't actually have a heavyweight title. The closest thing it had to one was Coleman's openweight title. So at Pride 17, in November of 2001, they held their inaugural heavyweight title match between Nogueira and Heath Herring. Despite being for the heavyweight title, it wasn't exactly a fight for the ages, as realistically, this was only Big Nog's 3rd fight in the promotion, and Heath Herring was on a whopping 1-fight win streak going into the match. Regardless, Big Nog won a hard-fought unanimous decision and became Pride's first ever heavyweight champion. But more so than his heavyweight title win, it was his fight with Bob Sapp at Shockwave 2002 that elevated Nogueira to almost mythical status. As mentioned previously, in the early 2000s, fighting Bob Sapp was a more intimidating prospect than when someone calls you instead of texting. Sapp debuted in Pride in April of 2002. He won his first 2 fights via a method known as outweighing your opponent by the mass of a collapsing star and clubbing their helpless little bodies into a heap of shattered bones in anguish. In his 3rd fight, he would face Nogueira for the heavyweight title. This wasn't a fight that either man really wanted. Sapp was intimidated by Nogueira's jiu-jitsu and had to be convinced by his trainer, Josh Barnett, that his body was simply too gargantuan for Nogueira's submissions to have an effect on. To successfully armbar Sapp would require the same kind of leverage used to topple the statue of Saddam Hussein. Nogueira, for obvious reasons, wasn't thrilled at the notion of taking on a man who looks like he was responsible for a collapse in the global supply chain of human growth hormone.
To all the Beast fans, or should I say family, the Beast looks forward to putting on that Pride belt and taking it from Nogueira.
But when Pride offered to pay double his normal fight purse, he agreed. On 2 weeks' notice. To fight this man, after having just fought 20 days prior. What the fuck were fighters made of in those days? I don't mean to keep banging this drum, but I know most of us think of Bob Sapp as a 400-pound punchline nowadays, after jamming out to his classic track Sapp Time and seeing him take more dives than an Olympic swim team. But the night he faced Minotauro Nogueira, Bob Sapp might just have been the most terrifying heavyweight in the universe. As the fight opened, Nogueira shot in for a takedown, A smart move when executed on someone with normal human proportions, but on Metal Gear Flex, it was an invitation to catastrophe. Sapp Uno reversed Nogueira's shot and, grabbing him by the waist and hoisting him like some kind of meat flag, executed what's known in pro wrestling as a Ganzo bomb, and in everyday life as the most excessive way imaginable to murder a man. Nogueira was driven headfirst into the mat by 400 pounds of rage-inflated muscle.
Picks him up, tries for a pile driver, and it actually picks him up, tries for a pile driver.
Shockingly, he survived, but the fight was still only seconds old, and Nogueira had 9+ minutes left to endure in round 1. Sapp was simply too big for Nogueira's technique to work on. He muscled out of positions that would have led to the end for lesser men. He reversed other positions simply by rolling over. He slammed his way out of a triangle attempt, but worst of all, he landed some of the most hilariously violent ground and pound imaginable. There's a grim fascination in seeing all 400 pounds of Sapp attempting to pass Nogueira's guard by doing a leaping hammer fist directly onto his prone body. No human being that large should be able to move like this. It's anathema to such a colossal frame, something akin to seeing an Abrams tank Tokyo drifting. Midway through round 1, the commentary team of Rutan, Quadros, and guest commentator Bill Goldberg were aghast at what they were seeing.
We're watching something here in the best heavyweight in the world being manhandled by a monster.
Nogueira had taken the worst beating of his career, and possibly the worst beating we've seen in this series since Inoue vs Vovchanchyn. At this point, Nogueira was probably feeling nostalgic for the truck. Miraculously, Big Nog survived the first 10-minute round, and Sapp had just fought for longer than the sum total of every one of his fights thus far. But Sapp required a bigger power supply than the Xbox 360's, and had just used every last ounce of energy his monolithic frame could provide. Early in round 2, an already badly gassed Sapp somehow found the energy to powerbomb his way out of another triangle attempt, but in doing so, depleted what little energy he had left. Nogueira's grit, determination, and experience were now worth more than any amount of size and gym muscles. Proving himself worthy of his veteran status, he locked in an armbar and slayed the giant.
Unbelievable, guys. Absolutely unbelievable.
As 90,000 fans filled the Tokyo National Stadium with a single full-throated roar, and a battered Nogueira was proclaimed the winner, Quadros and Rutan both exclaimed, "Who can beat Nogueira?" A good question. If a man who outweighs him by 200 pounds of brute force muscle can't do it, surely no man born of woman could beat Minotauro Nogueira in a fist fight. Well, it turns out there was one. Okay, Bob, I did the thing. I made you sound like a total badass. Are you gonna tell me what you've done with Creepy Hayachi now? Where's the body? Okay, just one more time. Do you get AdSense revenue from this or something? Fedor Emelianenko is a man that realistically should need no introduction, but I'll attempt to give him one anyway. I mean, Krokop and Nogueira got one, so it would be rude not to. Born in Ukraine in 1976, Fedor grew up in a small mining town in Russia called Stary Oskol, roughly 600 kilometers south of Moscow. Fedor is a true stoic, the kind of man to never use two words where one will do, or to crack a smile when an emotionless stare colder than the winds of a Russian winter will suffice. There is no better way to summarize Fedor's personality than to take a look at how long it takes this interviewer to ask him one question and how quickly it takes Fedor to answer it.
Вы занимаетесь как раз тем профессионал, высочайший профессионал в тех видах спорта, которые в простонародье называют довольно грубо, но я не буду называть, вы знаете как, там мордобой и прочее, да? То есть вот туда, вот. Скажите, пожалуйста, мне вот просто вот это личный абсолютно вопрос, я имею право за столько программ задать личный вопрос вот, Федору Емельяненко. Вы же живете тоже, да, по земле ходите, и часто в жизни, просто идя по улице или в каких-то других ситуациях, вы встречаете ситуацию, сегодня же очень много хамства откровенного. Очень много, его стало очень много. Скажите, пожалуйста, как мужчина и как спортсмен, который как раз занимается не шахматами, когда вы попадаете, Федор, в такую ситуацию, у вас кулаки сжимаются или нет? Или профессионально не сжимаются?
Я не попадаю в такие ситуации.
A lifelong martial artist, he had been competing in judo and sambo from the age of 11. Despite initially being unimpressive in his judo career, his trainer, Vladimir Voronov, recognized something special in the young Emelianenko. He spoke of a fire in his eyes that was just waiting to be harnessed, a rawness worth refining, and true to his word, Voronov would be by Fedor's side for the entirety of his fighting career. Fedor trained hard enough to make the Olympic judo team, but the wages for being an Olympic judoka simply weren't enough to support his family, and so, in 2000, he transitioned to the world of MMA. Did I also mention he has the most attractive mother in MMA? I mean, look at this queen, my god.
Chic. 彼の顎は夜にあってもスベスベ。世界最高4枚まで超深剃り。夜もスベフィカ。シッククワトロ4ミッドナイト誕生。
Fedor entered MMA practically in his final form. Whereas others were learning facets of the sport as they went, Fedor held the title of Master of Sport in Sambo, a prototype of MMA that's a mix of grappling, striking, and live-action recreation of the Gulag riot from Call of Duty Black Ops. Fedor had unimpeachable grappling skills and the obelisk-like frame of a natural heavyweight that meant when he hit with the devastating impact of a woman telling you we need to talk. From 2000 to 2002, he fought in rings, the same organisation that Nogueira had cut his horns in. In his 2-year tenure there, he fought 11 times, with his sole loss being a fight that realistically should have been declared a no contest due to a doctor's stoppage for a cut. His Pride debut was at Pride 21 Demolition in July of 2002. As debuts go, Fedor's was definitely more bleach than appetite for destruction. Despite being a rings champion, he didn't even get so much as a pre-fight interview, and most of the discussion around the fight seemed to be focused on his opponent, the 6'11" giant Semi Schilt. Fedor seemed to be barely a footnote in the show. Pride 21 was a mostly underwhelming card, and Fedor's debut did nothing to try and buck that trend. He took down Schilt within seconds of the opening bell, and for 15 minutes, that's exactly where the fight stayed. Fedor was awarded the decision, but his win, and everything else on the card, was overshadowed by the main event. Don Frye versus Takayama. Despite a lackluster start, only 2 fights later, at Pride 25 Body Blow, Fedor would face Nogueira for the heavyweight title, and the two men's careers would become inextricably linked. Earlier in this video, I stated that if not for the birth of Fedor, Nogueira would have had a claim on being the best heavyweight of all time. Unfortunately for Big Nog, Fedor was not a figment of his imagination, and as Bas Rutten probably would have said, he was coming in pride. MMA was evolving faster than a Gen 1 Pokemon, and while Big Nog had been atop the evolutionary tree for 2002, his rivalry with Fedor would be so one-sided it reduced him to the evolutionary equivalent of the coccyx. In areas where Minotauro was good, Fedor was great. In areas where Minotauro was great, Fedor was excellent. When the two eventually met at Pride 25 in March of 2003, it was a true changing of the guard. Minotauro was considered the best heavyweight in the world on that March evening. His triangle choke, probably his most feared weapon, had been the death knell for Mark Coleman and Enson Inoue, two former Lineal champions. But Fedor was a different beast. He was more than willing to meet Nogueira on the ground, where Big Nog was most comfortable, and thoroughly dismantle him. For every submission attempt, Fedor would pay him back in kind, with a barrage of emotionless Slavic punches. After 3 rounds, Fedor won a unanimous decision, and became the new Pride heavyweight champion. And all of this brings us back to the night that Cro Cop beat Vovchanchyn, and his call-out of a deeply emotional Fedor. If you recall, Gary Goodridge had broken Fedor's hand by headbutting it repeatedly, so the fight between Fedor and Cro Cop was put on hold. With their heavyweight champion out for an indeterminate amount of time, Pride created an interim heavyweight title, and so, on the 9th of November 2003, the Lineal title and the interim heavyweight title would be on the line, when Nogueira and Cro Cop met at Pride Final Conflict 2003. Final Conflict was the climax of Pride's first ever middleweight tournament. The opening round had been held in August, and was notable as this was the tournament where Dana had conscripted Chuck Liddell
we got Chuck Liddell
and shipped him off to Japan to prove that the UFC was, in the words of Dennis Rodman, the ultimate fighting of fighting. Unfortunately for Dana, a prime Rampage Jackson stood in their way at Final Conflict 2003 and beat Dana's one-time Golden Boy mercilessly for 13 minutes straight. Even had Chuck won, he would have then been faced with the grim prospect of fighting Prime Vanderlei Silva that same night. So Rampage probably saved him a few brain cells, and God knows he could do with them right now. And in the marquee fight of Final Conflict 2003, Cro Cop faced Nogueira. Big Nog had developed somewhat of a reputation post-Bob Sapp fight as being a fighter that can find a way to win, despite taking the kind of kicking normally reserved for the comment section on We Did It Again by Metallica featuring Ja Rule, which, unfortunately for the hearing-abled, is a real thing that exists, and even if you're lucky enough to have never heard it, you actually have, because I've played it 3 times so far in this video. That's how I got you, because if I have to suffer, I'm taking you all with me. In his match with Cro Cop, Nogueira's reputation for snatching victory from the jaws of getting soccer kicked into the sunless realms would be tested harder than John Jones on a Colombian vacation. Nogueira managed to take Cro Cop down in the opening minute, but couldn't hold him there. After 3 minutes of ineffective guard work, Mirko got back to his feet and proceeded to beat the country breakfast out of Big Nog for the remaining 7 minutes. He punished him with straight lefts and liver kicks, and with barely a second left in the round, delivered a cemetery kick to the head that flatlined Nogueira. Had there been 5 more seconds left in the round for Cro Cop to deliver a follow-up shot, the fight would have been stopped, but as Nogueira sank towards the canvas, he was quite literally saved by the bell. In round 2, Big Nog emerged from his corner, bloodied and half concussed, but after the Sapp fight, this was practically counted as a buff for Minotauro. Not taking any risks, he took Cro Cop down as soon as possible, passed to full mount, and began raining down ground and pound. As Cro Cop attempted to buck his way out from under full mount, Nogueira snatched his arm, and in an instant, applied a fully locked in, belly down armbar. For the first time in his career, Cro Cop was forced to tap.
Fedor
67,000 fans gave Nogueira a standing ovation that night. For as stunned as Bas Rutten and part-time commentator full-time jabroni Damon Perry were, the Japanese commentary team of Eiko Koike and Masaharu Miyake went into a critical meltdown. Eiko began crying hysterically, and Masaharu was screaming like he was the Godzilla early warning system. Pride was a time of gods and kings. When the tears dried and the screaming ceased, Antonio Minotauro Nogueira was proclaimed the 8th lineal title holder.
How was that? When you got off, you didn't do nothing. You boxed, you good boxer. Yeah. Rodrigo, you boxed well, man. You're gonna see. I'm proud of you. I'm really proud of you.
How can the light that burns so brightly suddenly...
Post-lineal title, Cro Cop's career carried on much as before. He was still in his prime, and to compensate for a hard loss, Pride fed him a few more cans to build his stock back up. He eventually worked his way back to title contention and fought Fedor for the real heavyweight title in 2005. But if it wasn't obvious by now, Fedor was the final boss of Pride's heavyweight division, and neither Nogueira nor Cro Cop were running the right build to stop him. Hell, Fedor even has a straight-to-DVD movie called The Fifth Salamander that outperformed Cro Cop's straight-to-DVD movie Ultimate Force by almost 2 full points on IMDb. There was no area where this man was beatable. The highlight of Cro Cop's career would come in 2006, when he won the Pride Openweight Grand Prix, a tournament that featured Josh Barnett, Mark Hunt, Fabricio Verdum, and because it wouldn't be an openweight tournament without him, Minowa Man, to name just 4. In probably his crowning achievement, Cro Cop headkick KO'd Vanderlei in the semi-final and made Josh Barnett tap to strikes in the final, all of which took place in one night. Having never been able to take the title from Fedor, Cro Cop's win of the openweight title was a bittersweet moment, the hardest fought consolation prize anyone could ever win. But the openweight GP was kind of the beginning of the end for Cro Cop. Pride itself would be nothing but ghosts and memories by 2007, and Mirko found himself adrift in a sea of promotions. 2007 started off well enough for Cro Cop, when he guest starred in a Japanese pro wrestling show called Hustle. The gimmick was that wrestlers spun a slot machine to decide what weapon they could use in the ring, and the top prize was the living weapon of Cro Cop himself. Mirko kind of forgot that his kicks were classified as a war crime under the Geneva Convention, and wound up hospitalizing a wrestler named Kintaman when he accidentally landed a full-force kick to his head. But stunts like this were just distractions, and so, in February of 2007, he returned to the world of MMA and joined the UFC. He made his debut at UFC 67, and for the first time in his career, he didn't walk out to Duran Duran's Wild Boys. Instead, he opted to walk out to the Pride theme. It was an oddly touching moment. A lone soldier carrying the standard of a once proud but now defeated legion. He went 1-2 in his first 3 fights, which isn't good, but only gets worse when you consider both the caliber of opponent he beat and the caliber of opponents who beat him. His lone win was over someone less recognizable than Banksy, and his losses were to perennial mid-carders Gabriel Gonzaga and Czech Congo.
Mirko looks tentative though. Oh my God!
You're probably wondering how things could get any worse for Cro Cop right about now. Pride, his home since 2003, was dead. He had just crashed out of the UFC in some less than glorious circumstances. His straight-to-Pirate Bay action movie Ultimate Force was taking a critical kicking worse than his actual kickings, and in 2008 he returned to Japan and signed on with a brand new promotion founded by former Pride and K1 executives called Dream. Cro Cop was back in his adopted home of Japan and won his first fight in Dream with ease. This all sounds pretty positive, so how could things get worse? Well, how about having the misfortune to face a proto-Uberim in your second fight and get kneed in the balls so hard one of your testicles ascends into your abdomen? And to make matters worse, the only genuine smile Fedor has ever cracked in his life was seeing you almost become half a eunuch. As new beginnings go, it was a fairly inauspicious one. In 2009, he would return to the UFC and picked up a couple of wins over NPC's Mustafa Al-Turk and Anthony Peroche. He even did the world a solid and beat all-round creep Pat Barry mercilessly while the ref appeared to be taking a smoke break. But worryingly, even a bum like Pat Barry managed to drop Cro Cop in round 1, and it was really his own hero worship of Mirko that caused him to freeze up, unable to finish his own idol. Cro Cop had well and truly snatched victory from the jaws of the creep. So you're probably wondering how things could get any worse for Cro Cop right about now. What's worse than almost getting knocked out by a man who views the age of consent as a barrier for entry? How about getting knocked out by a man whose in-octagon stand-up is only the second worst stand-up on his resume? Dicey! I don't quite know how to properly convey the absolute inner turmoil felt upon seeing Shab KO Cro Cop. The best analogy I can come up with is that it would be like watching your house burn down because the charger for the Homer Simpson shaped wireless prostate massager you bought on Wish.com exploded.
Shab knocks out Mirko Cro Cop! Knocks out Mirko Cro Cop! Knocks out Mirko Cro Cop! Knocks out Mirko Cro Cop!
This was the true nadir of Cro Cop's career. A knockout loss to Roy Nelson later, and Mirko's disastrous second tenure in the UFC ended. In a funny coincidence though, Shab's next fight would be against Big Nog. What a funny coincidence that is.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
Bob, if God is good, why did he allow Brendan Schaub to knock out Cro Cop? I get where you're coming from. I can't reconcile living in a world where Schaub is allowed to knock out Cro Cop and just carry on like nothing happened. Is God unwilling or just unable to prevent evil like that? Your answer to everything is listen to Sapp time. It's not some cure-all for the world's problem. Oh, gee, hang on, I love this bit. Oh man, that's good. For a lot of people, Cro Cop's catastrophic run in the UFC is where his story ends. They simply stopped following his career out of sheer depression at how it was unfolding, or just assumed the respectable thing to do after losing to someone like Schaub would be immediate retirement, followed by requesting that the entire world undergo an Eternal Sunshine-esque mind wipe to forget you ever existed. But Cro Cop wasn't done, and his career would undergo a bizarre resurgence. K1, the promotion where Cro Cop had debuted, was on the verge of collapse by 2010. Its parent company, FEG, was almost bankrupt. The whole K1 brand was put up for sale, and was eventually bought by a company called MCOM Entertainment. In a last-ditch attempt to resuscitate K1, an 8-man heavyweight Grand Prix was announced for 2012, but would take until 2013 to actually kick off. Cro Cop was the star of the show, and for the first time ever, a K1 Grand Prix would be held outside of Japan, in Zagreb, Croatia to be precise. This whole thing felt like some kind of MMA Truman Show, an entire event built around ensuring Cro Cop gets a win, and that feeling only increased in the opening round, after he was gifted a decision win in a fight that, by all rights, he should have lost. But fuck all that, because at the age of 37, and 13 years after losing to Ernesto Hoost in the finals of the '99 Grand Prix, Mirko went all the way, and finally won his first ever K1 Grand Prix. But the Chronaissance didn't end there. In 2016, JMMA promotion Rizin was only just starting, and so did what most fight promotions do to attract attention in those formative years. Put on a whole bunch of freak show shit. But they also exhumed a whole host of aging talent, roided up freak beasts, and spiritual successors to Hong Man Choi to take part in a 16-man Grand Prix. The original lineup for the Rizin 2016 Grand Prix was like a who's who of fighters you had assumed already retired or died about a decade ago. Vanderlei Silva, Shane Carwin and Cro Cop were all set to take part, though Carwin and Silva would drop out due to injuries before the Grand Prix began. Then you had the real weird shit, like a 6'6" Estonian sumo wrestler and an Iranian wrestler who was banned for life from wrestling thanks to doping violations. Do you know how much gear you have to be on to get banned from wrestling for life? They're all on something. Cro Cop stormed his way through a cavalcade of freaks and bums, and in the true spirit of pride, it was glorious. 1 submission and 4 knockouts over opponents of varying quality later, and Cro Cop had won another World Grand Prix.
Well, fighting in Japan is a special feeling for me, and especially I'm one of the last of my generation from Pride, but I'm still standing.
Buoyed by his success in Rizin, he joined Bellator in February of 2019, and his lone fight for the promotion was a decision win over Roy Nelson. Unbeknownst to Cro Cop at the time, it would be his last fight. A month later, he suffered a stroke. Thankfully, he survived and recovered without any lasting damage, but it spelled the end of his almost 3-decade-long fighting career. Speaking to Croatian TV, Mirko said, "It is over. I hope I will not cry, but that is it." Cro Cop retired on a 10-fight win streak, something very, very few fighters get to do. His career was built on pure, unbridled talent, but also benefited from some favourable matchmaking on behalf of Pride. The end result was a name that became synonymous with violent knockouts, and one of the most feared and revered fighters of the mid-2000s. His UFC run may have been disappointing, whether down to age or drug testing or Cro Cop's dislike of the cage itself, but Cro Cop's home was always Japan. It was where he shone brightest, and ending his career by winning the Rizin Grand Prix in the Saitama Super Arena was about as poetic an ending as one can get in MMA. Nowadays, he's still training, can still do the splits, and can occasionally be found rescuing puppies. And definitely not having sex.
Show yourself! Our new ruler, the Emperor!
Back in 2004, Nogueira was now both the Lineal heavyweight champion and the Pride interim heavyweight champion. But as this story unfolds, it becomes apparent that the picture of the Lineal timeline in 2004 is like that of a Penrose triangle, complicated at first glance, but ultimately made of 3 distinct points: Cro Cop, Nogueira, and Fedor. If you've been paying any attention to the UFC's heavyweight division in 2024, you'll know that interim titles have become more useless than an arts degree from Hustlers University. It's accepted knowledge that if you win an interim title, your next fight should be against the champion to unify the titles, but nowadays it's common for interim title holders to defend their interim title, while the champion is off blasting more rails than a Quake 3 match. While this might seem like a modern day problem, back in 2003, the interim title in Pride was treated much the same way. Nogueira wouldn't get any kind of immediate shot at unifying the belts. Instead, Fedor, Cro Cop, and Nogueira, the 3 best fighters on the planet at that point, would forge a path towards each other as part of a 16-man tournament that ran from April to August. Pride Total Elimination 2004.
Okay, now Kevin's words were exactly, and this is nothing bad against you, by the way, or because he says, one of us is going to get knocked the fuck out. That was his exactly words. He says, it's going to be him or it's going to be me.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I think so.
To the surprise of almost everyone, Cro Cop crashed out of the opening round of Total Elimination in one of the biggest upsets in Pride history when he was knocked out of both the tournament and consciousness by Kevin Randleman. In his tournament journey, Nogueira would successfully defend the Lineal and interim titles 3 times. He scored back-to-back anaconda choke submissions, firstly over a jobber named Hirotaka Yokoi, then perennial punching bag Heath Herring, and lastly a unanimous decision win over a Russian kickboxer named Sergei Haritonov. On the opposite side of the tournament, Fedor was forging a path of his own. The original Lineal champion Mark Coleman fell to a Fedor armbar, and in one of the most stunning moments in MMA history, Fedor somehow survived being hit with the Kevin Randleman remix of the Ganzo bomb. Randleman took both he and Fedor airborne in a giga-suplex the likes of which has never been seen since. Despite having his head used to test the durability of the ring, Fedor survived and submitted Randleman with a Kimura. His last fight was against Naoya Ogawa. Ogawa was an Olympic silver medalist in judo, and perhaps because Fedor had never actually made it to the Olympics, Ogawa seemed somewhat dismissive of him and refused the glove touch.
He's got it! And he's forced the tap! Whoa! Silver medalist judo just got tabbed and world champion by Fedor Emelianenko!
With the win over Ogawa, a showdown between Nogueira and Fedor in the final was secured. This was pretty much the biggest fight possible to make. Not 1, but technically 3 titles were on the line. Fedor's heavyweight championship, Nogueira's interim championship, and the Lineal heavyweight title. This was the pair's first fight since Fedor had won a unanimous decision over Big Nog and taken the Pride heavyweight title from him back in 2003. Since then, Nogueira had gone on a 5-fight win streak, and Fedor was still undefeated in Pride, riding a 10-fight win streak since his debut at Pride 25 and an overall win streak of 16. It's honestly hard to convey just how big this fight was. These were undoubtedly the 2 best fighters on the planet, fighting each other in their prime, so expectations were practically stratospheric. But expectations are a fickle thing. I waited 13 years for a sequel to Alan Wake, and what I eventually got was a walking simulator that dreamt it was a third-person shooter, and a game so in love with its own narrative that it bordered on incest. Expectations can be cruel, and even the final of Total Elimination 2004 wasn't immune from delivering more disappointment than a lifetime subscription to Disney+. After all the hype, and almost a year's worth of build-up, Nogueira vs Fedor was declared a no contest, after a clash of heads opened a gigantic cut on Fedor's forehead early in round 1. The fight was rescheduled for the 31st of December 2004 at Pride Shockwave. It was New Year's Eve 2004. Halfway through a decade that had shocked us awake, but was now lulling us back to apathy with its new Vietnam, for one night all of that could be forgotten. On that night, 2 men laid claim to the title of greatest fighter in the world. But by New Year's Day, when 2005 had been ripped violently from the womb to take its first pitiful breaths, only one man would remain as Pride heavyweight champion, Lineal MMA champion, and greatest fighter in the world. Minotauro fought valiantly. When Fedor left an arm in for so much as a second, Nogueira was on it. When Fedor presented a leg for a fraction longer than he should have, Nogueira was attempting to rip it off at the knee. What I'm saying is that Nogueira did everything he possibly could have, and by the last gasps of the 3rd round, he was still trying everything under his power to win. Do you know what it's like to try your absolute best at something, to give it the utmost effort and dedication, only to miss the mark by a margin so wide you would have done just as well had you simply stayed at home? That was the story of this fight for Minotauro. Fedor's strength in this fight was utterly ludicrous. Nogueira routinely fought at around 240 pounds. Fedor quite literally threw him around the ring like he was nothing. Whenever the two clinched, Nogueira was sent flying, as Fedor just casually tossed all 240 pounds of him to the mat. Going into the fight, Nogueira's ground game was seen as his key to victory, but Fedor must have missed that meeting because he very clearly viewed Nogueira's guard as just another place he could embarrass him in. He showed a contempt for jiu-jitsu so thorough that black belts worldwide began frantically untucking their shirts. On the feet, on the ground, and in the clinch, Fedor beat Nogueira in every aspect of a fight possible. As 2005 slouched towards dawn, its hour come at last, Fedor Emelianenko, the last emperor, was left standing as the greatest fighter in the world and became the 9th Lineal MMA heavyweight champion. In the 4 years since his debut, Nogueira had fought an almost unbelievable 29 times. So it's no real surprise that after losing both the Lineal title and the Pride heavyweight title, his output became slower than that of Guns N' Roses. For the entire year of 2005, he only fought once, scoring a TKO win over a Polish jobber named Paweł Natsula. 2006 saw Big Nog enter the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. He made it to the finals, picking up wins over fighters such as Zulu Zinho, a professional tomato can whose sole fighting attribute was weighing 400 pounds. He also picked up a win over a far more skilled opponent, and one who has his own part to play in this story soon enough, Fabricio Werdum. Nogueira made it as far as the semi-finals, where he would lose a split decision to Josh Barnett. He would only fight one more time in Pride at Shockwave 2006. It's a little known fact outside of Japan that Pride's Shockwave events had a theme, but unlike say Noche UFC, Pride's themes were a little more esoteric. And I apologise profusely to any Japanese-speaking viewers for my butchering of the language here, but Shockwave 2004's theme was Sadame, meaning destiny, and 2005's was Itadaki, meaning summit. Somewhat ironically, 2006's theme was Fumetsu, meaning immortal or undying. Shockwave 2006 was taking place at the height of Pride's Yakuza scandal, so immortality was chosen almost as an act of defiance, a way of showing the public that Pride wasn't going anywhere. To further cement this, Pride Never Die was now being used as Pride's unofficial slogan. Nogueira had a rematch with Barnett at Shockwave 2006 and ended his storied tenure in Pride with a decision win. Less than 6 months later, despite their talk of Fumetsu, Pride was dead. 3 months after the organization's demise, Nogueira was a UFC fighter, and a new era for Minotauro began. His debut fight for the UFC was against none other than Heath Herring, a man who, despite never being lineal or actual champion, has popped up more often in these videos than violent George Costanza. Haha, there he is. Nogueira won a unanimous decision, and things seemed to be on the right track, as his next fight was a win over Tim Sylvia for the interim heavyweight title. But Nogueira and interim titles were a more iconic duo than Joe Rogan and a sexually attractive stool. Big Nog had been forced to defend the lineal and interim titles 3 times before he finally got to fight Fedor, and the UFC kept up that tradition. Brock Lesnar was the UFC heavyweight champion in 2007, but due to a medical condition called shitting your intestines out of your ass, he was sidelined for over a year. In the meantime, Nogueira would be forced to defend his interim title against Lesnar's nemesis, Frank Mir. To build up some heat for the fight, Nogueira would coach Season 8 of The Ultimate Fighter opposite Mir. I guess it's a testament to what a chill person Nogueira is, but I've made an entire video covering this season of The Ultimate Fighter, yet when it came time to write this video, I had completely forgotten he was ever a coach on that show. Although I suppose in a season that starred Junie Browning, it's no wonder Nogueira was given less screen time than an Amish toddler.
Red team, I see you, jerseys. I'm ready to fight.
I watched the tape, and it's retarded.
Yeah.
What's up with you? You're a drunken retard too. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Nogueira and Mir fought at UFC 92 in December of 2008. In a stunning upset, Mir sent Big Nog on the lightless walk in round 2. In almost a decade of competition, it was Nogueira's first ever TKO loss, and the beginning of his battle with the opponent every fighter fears most and none has ever bested, the inevitable decline. There were still some bright spots left in his career though, such as his war with Randy Couture in 2009, but by 2010, Nogueira was a fighter out of time. Sure, he could put on a good showing against the ghost of Randy and still beat journeymen all day long, but now the UFC were expecting him to fight hell beasts like a prime Cain Velasquez, which went about as well as you'd imagine. By 2011, this wasn't so much a decline as it was a free fall into the abyss. Regardless, he gave us another 5 years of heartbreak, the lowest point probably being his rematch with Frank Mir. Mir snapped his arm when Big Nog refused to tap to a Kimura. Despite Nogueira's refusal to tap, it was still counted as his first ever submission loss. But like a full moon emerging from behind a cloud bank and illuminating a desolate landscape, Nogueira had one moment of the divine left in his career. Around 7 hours ago when this video started, I mentioned that after Brendan Schaub knocked out Krokop, Schaub's next opponent just happened to be Big Nog. I also mentioned that Nogueira only had 3 knockouts on his record. Connect the dots here, people. Go back to the source. Follow the money.
I'll take my boxing against anyone in the heavyweight division, let alone Nogueira. So I definitely plan to keep it on the feet. In front of his hometown, in front of his home fans, I'm going to knock Nogueira out in Rio.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Watching this knockout today, being fully aware of Schaub's long and storied history of unlikability enriches the schadenfreude of this knockout by orders of magnitude. But in 2011, Schaub was simply a young, up-and-coming heavyweight who dreamed of one day being a failed comedian looking to make a name off beating some older fighters. So Big Nog serving him the only good punchline of his career was like turning back the clock on Nogueira's own career, if only just for one night.
How are you feeling right now?
Dana, I wanted my 100,000. Because he told me he's gonna beat me up in Brazil. He can respect me because I live 1 mile for the arena. It's 1 mile for the arena.
In 2012, he would score one last win against a journeyman named Dave Herman before settling into a 3-fight losing streak.
Check out Anderson Silva's reaction to this. He's in tears. He's so happy.
Proving just how beloved Nogueira was, Dana simply couldn't bear to see him lose anymore. He refused to offer him any more fights, and instead offered him a position within the UFC. Dana said, "He and I are going to get together, and we're going to talk. I'm probably going to give him the Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes and Forrest Griffin deal. I'm going to bring him in and make him an employee." For anyone unaware, Chuck, Forrest and Hughes were all given cushy office jobs as a thank you for their in-octagon service. Forrest was the only one with enough brains and common decency to actually turn up and do a day's work as part of this 30 grand per month gig, and as such, when the UFC was sold in 2016, he kept his job, while Hughes became the least successful train spotter in America, and Chuck came out of both retirement and a care home for one more fight with Tito. Nogueira was given a position within the UFC, and as of 2024, both Forrest and Big Nog are still UFC employees. Nogueira retired as the only man to ever hold titles in both the UFC and Pride. It's easy to feel like his career played out in the shadow of Fedor, but to say that is to do a disservice to the man who fought monsters and won, who took on the challengers others balked at, and had the singular toughness of both body and mind to find a way to win where all others would have crumbled. Nogueira's life, and by extension career, are a testament to the resilience and toughness of the human spirit. At this point in the story, the lineal timeline was Coleman, Smith, Couture, Inoue, Kerr, Fujita, Krokop, Nogueira, and Fedor. Until Fedor, the record for lineal title defenses remained stalled at 3. Inoue, Krokop, and now Nogueira hadn't been able to clear that particular hurdle. Fedor's reign as lineal champion was longer than every previous lineal title holder combined. From January 1st, 2005 until the 26th of June 2010, Fedor would prove to be untouchable. His lineal title reign would outlive Pride itself. But everything in this universe is subject to entropy. Oceans turn to desert, mountains crumble, and even an emperor must fall. So I know I don't normally do post-credit scenes like this, but I just needed to give a bit of special recognition to a few people. Firstly, I know you've probably seen Violent J as the executive producer on these recent videos, and you probably just thought that's me being wacky and putting some rando famous person's name in the credits because that's absolutely the kind of shit I would do. But believe it or not, Violent J, the insane clown guy, the miracles guy, has actually been a really big supporter of this channel, whether it's posting about me on his socials, or offering to fly me out to the States to make a video about his wrestling shows, or the time he randomly PayPal'd me money when he couldn't figure out how to sign up to Patreon. He's been a genuinely huge supporter of this channel, and it is the strangest thing to ever happen to me in my life. But just to try and return the favour here, as I know there's some crossover between pro wrestling fans and MMA fans on this channel thanks to my Lesnar and CM Punk videos, but Violent J has started a new indie wrestling promotion called JCW Lunacy. The events are on YouTube, and I know he's put everything he has into making these shows and trying to get JCW Lunacy off the ground, so if you're a pro wrestling fan, I've linked it in the description, so maybe go take a look and support someone who's been a big supporter of mine. Secondly, if you've made it this far, thank you. I know historically the Lineal series hasn't done big numbers in terms of views, but I feel like it's a series for people who are actually interested in this sport and its history, and not just stupid bullshit drama videos or whatever this week's YouTube metagame is. Outside of the Lesnar video, all I've done this year has been the Lineal story, so it really is a case of this being for the real fans from a real fan. So if you've made it this far, thank you. And to everyone who went the extra mile and signed up to Patreon, thank you especially. And before I go, I just have to give one last shout out to Lake City Quiet Pills. This video would not have been the same without your music. This man is clinically insane because he's legitimately an award-winning musician, yet he takes the time out of his day to write original music for glorified shitposts about Bob Sapp, and he's not even getting paid to do this. Despite me hounding him to upload the tracks he's made for these videos somewhere that people can buy or stream them, he still hasn't done it, but he does have one album that you can buy on Bandcamp, and eventually I will harass him enough to get all of these tracks compiled into an album so that people can listen to them without having to hear me talk over them. And with that, thank you, and I will see you all in the next video.